We have breaking news tonight from David Cay Johnston about Donald Trump's tax returns. There is simply no better tax reporter than David Cay Johnston. He won the Pulitzer Prize for tax reporting when he was at the New York Times, and that's why he was trusted by an anonymous source who delivered the summary pages of Donald Trump's 2005 tax return that David Cay Johnston first made public on Rachel Maddow's show. Tonight, in an article just published at the Daily Beast, David Cay Johnston reveals that Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and IRS Commissioner Charles Rettig are now in serious danger of violating Section 7214 of the tax code, which could be punishable by 5 years in prison. Section 7214 is entitled Offenses by Officers and Employees of the United States. It says any officer or employee of the United States acting in connection with any revenue law of the United States who, with intent to defeat the application of any provision of this law, fails to perform any of the duties of his office or employment shall be dismissed from office or discharged from employment and, upon conviction thereof, shall be fined not more than $10,000 or imprisoned not more than 5 years or both. That simply means any federal employee, including the president or White House chief of staff or the Treasury secretary or the IRS commissioner who tries to defeat the application of tax law, has committed a crime and shall be fired. It doesn't say may be fired. It says shall be dismissed from office. It is a very clear and simple law that controls the behavior of all federal employees when they deal with anything involving tax law. This law is now intersecting with Section 6103 of the tax code, which we've already discussed on this program. That is the law that requires the IRS commissioner to hand over any tax returns demanded by the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee or the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. Chairman Richard Neal of the Ways and Means Committee has demanded Donald Trump's tax returns under Section 6103, and that leaves absolutely no choice on the part of the IRS commissioner other than to hand over those tax returns. Earlier this week, when testifying to the House Appropriations Subcommittee, Secretary Mnuchin said this about Chairman Neal's demand for Donald Trump's tax returns.
We did receive the request, and as I've said in the past, when we received the request, it would be reviewed by our legal department, and it is our intent to follow the law.
Our intent to follow the law. In his letter last night to Chairman Neal, Secretary Mnuchin said, "We have begun consultations with the Department of Justice to ensure that our response is fully consistent with the law and the Constitution." So, has anyone told Steve Mnuchin before this very moment right now on television that the law he has to worry about the most in this case is the one that could send him to prison for 5 years? Joining our discussion now, David Cay Johnston. He's the founder of DCReport.org and author of It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. And David, one of the many things that was so illuminating to me when I read your reporting tonight is, as you and I both know, as I think the country knows, the tax code is a monster. It is our most intimidating body of law for so many people. I've written some of it. I've read more of it, certainly, than I've written. I've been studying it for decades. I don't know everything in there. And so I had no idea that there was this section governing all federal employees. And by the way, David, that means it was governing me when I was working on the Senate Finance Committee. But any decent person working around this subject behaves exactly the way the law requires anyway. You don't even have to know what the law is. But I certainly didn't know that this provision existed. I am willing to bet everything I have that Steve Mnuchin did not know it and might not have known it until either tonight or possibly the last couple of days, that if he doesn't watch every step he takes and every word he says, he's risking 5 years in prison.
Well, I was familiar with this law but hadn't thought of it because, as you point out, our tax code is an indefensible mess. And one of my sources today suggests I go back and look at this section, and I suddenly realized it's totally comprehensive. It even includes failure to act, not just sins of commission, but sins of omission. And it made what got me to thinking about all this was I was watching the sharp disparity between Donald Trump's lie that the law is 100% on his side and Mick Mulvaney's reckless statement to Fox News compared to the very nuanced comments that Commissioner Rettig and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin were making to Congress. And I thought, now, what's going on here? Why are these two men being so careful to never say, we won't turn it over? They want to delay, they want to find an excuse. And the minute I looked at the section 7214, I went, oh, that's exactly why. And my guess is Treasury Department lawyers guided their comments. Mnuchin has made what I call in the piece artful statements about this.
Yes, and as we both know, there is a counsel at the Treasury Department who's a Trump appointee, but there's a bunch of lawyers working under that counsel in that office who've been there in some cases for decades, who know all of these things. And so that's the kind of information that they would rush up to the Treasury Secretary as early in this process as possible, I would think. And so it could very well be likely, especially when you look at exactly the words Mnuchin's been using, that he's known about this law for at least a couple of weeks.
Yes, and part of the problem I suspect that Secretary Mnuchin has is he could have just laid this all off on Charles Rettig, the former tax lawyer for rich people who got caught cheating, who now runs the IRS, because there's a delegation order, as you had Larry Summers pointing out on the show the other night, that it's the IRS commissioner who is responsible here. Mnuchin may not have had good advice in the beginning. He got drawn into this. And frankly, anybody in the White House who's a political operative, not the White House lawyers who represent the executive office, not the president personally, but anybody who's a political operative in the White House who touched this may also be at risk. And this is something that Congress, as part of its investigation, needs to look at, because there is a clear effort here by the president and his chief of staff to defeat the laws of the United States.
David, in my reading of the law tonight, since you illuminated it for us, it seems to me that Mick Mulvaney, of everyone in that administration, is the one who has come closest to a criminal violation of that law by publicly saying those tax returns will never be turned over. Now, that's the White House chief of staff speaking for the president, speaking directly to the IRS commissioner. He's doing it through television, but he knows he's speaking to the IRS commissioner when he says that. He knows he's speaking to the Treasury Secretary when he says that, even though he's saying it on television. And so this could be one of those instances where Mulvaney had absolutely no idea. I think my suspicion is from your reporting tonight, we won't be hearing Mulvaney say those words again.
Well, if he does, it's incredibly reckless, Lawrence. And we need to keep in mind that what we're seeing going on with this administration is obstruction of justice right in front of our eyes. They're doing it out in the open, thinking that that may in some way insulate them. It does not. There's no requirement that you operate in secret when you're trying to defeat the laws of the United States.
David Cay Johnston, really important reporting tonight in the Daily Beast. Everyone should grab it right now, read it right now. David, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.